Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is the show, What's Left? And I'm your host, Larry Erickson. For the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about something that I think is important. So I hope you'll be listening and watching. If you have any reactions to the show, you can send them to me directly. My personal email is right here over here. It's whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or if you prefer, you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here somewhere during the show. And you can get the email address from there if you missed it, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, as always, to requests, include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, and please be a little patient about getting an answer. All right, with that, let's get to it. I did have a regular show planned. I had some good news. I was going to do an RIP for Mary Tyler Moore at a Clown Award and other stuff, but I threw all that aside in order to cover this because this is important. And I'm going to say at the beginning, I'm not going to mislead you in any of this. But the fact is, we are in for a lot of trouble. We are in for a long slog and a hard fight. Our democracy is literally at risk. Now, I do not want to oversell this. We as a people survived the repression that occurred during World War I. We survived the McCarthy era. We survived the presidential coup of Watergate. We may well survive this too. But that doesn't change the fact that our present peril is real. As we see moves to put more and more power in the hands of fewer and fewer people that are reactionaries and corporatists, and who are being cheered on by an unthinking mass of people who see in the very word Trump, not in any particular policy, not in any particular thing, but in the very word, the very concept of Trump, an answer to their very real pains and distresses and a full justification for their bigotry. What we're seeing that is looking more and more like a slow-motion coup. We have, for example, seen top officers at the State Department removed, leaving the department effectively devoid of senior experienced staff. We have seen the Director of National Intelligence and the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff removed from being regular members of the National Security Council to be replaced by the notorious bigot Steve Bannon. We have seen gag orders on science agencies, information on climate change and the Affordable Care Act removed from the White House website. We have seen other attacks on the flow of public information. We have seen attempts to intimidate the press, along with favoritism shown to right-wing outlets that will ask the question that the White House gangsters want to be asked. We have seen them shut down the White House comment line, so uninterested are they in actual public input. We have seen that the Rump's Muslim travel ban was the work of a small clique that was issued without the use or the advice or the knowledge of the State Department, the DHS, or the Congress. In fact, we have learned that they actually poached some congressional staff from one member to help draft the ban and then put them under a non-disclosure agreement so that they had to keep even their own boss in the dark about what they'd done. We have seen them openly defy orders from multiple federal courts blocking part of that travel ban, only to have, in the wake of those federal court orders, have the DHS say that the Rump's orders, quote, remain in place, prohibited travel will remain prohibited, and Customs and Border Patrol agents continue to enforce that order, in some cases denying detained persons from access to legal counsel. After dozens of U.S. Foreign Service officers and diplomats used the State Department dissent channel, which had been specifically created to allow for the expression of dissent from official policy, they used this channel in order to express opposition to this Muslim travel ban. The response was the administration told those career diplomats to, literally in these words, get with the program or go. It was enough that the Philadelphia Inquirer was moved to say in an editorial, quote, from spreading bald lies to suppressing basic facts and information, the early days of the Trump administration are suggestive of a tin pot dictatorship. And I would say that in the days following the publication of that editorial, the impression has not changed. If anything, it's gotten stronger. So yes, we are in for hard times and a long slog as the White House gangsters look more and more like the fanatics they are, not only unalterably devoted to increasing their own power, but increasingly paranoid about any expression of opposition. Now, I could spend the entire rest of the show just going through the horrors of what occurred in this last week, but instead of doing that, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I am going to celebrate resistance. And what better place to start with that celebration? What better time to start than January 21st, the day of what may well have been the largest day of demonstrations in U.S. history. The current best guess is that something over 4.1 million people took part, hit the streets on that day at some 653 events. There were actions in every single state of the Union. From over 700,000 in Washington, D.C., to 450,000 in Los Angeles and an equal number in New York, to 250,000 in Chicago, to 175,000 in Boston, to 150,000 in Denver, to 150,000 in San Francisco, and another 100,000 across the Bay in Oakland, to 135,000 in Seattle, to tens of thousands in Atlanta, tens of thousands in Philadelphia. Tens of thousands more in places like Austin and Houston, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, Cleveland, Ohio, Des Moines, Iowa, Hartford, Connecticut, Helena, Montana, Madison, Wisconsin, Miami, Florida, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And hundreds more places with participants numbering in the thousands or maybe the hundreds or the scores or the tens or maybe just a handful, but still out there to speak with one intense, loud, and dare I say even joyful voice that what is before us will not go unchallenged. Now, some among the national organizers and at some of the local events too tried to insist that these were not anti-Trump actions. In fact, they were non-political, but of course they were anti-Trump and they were political. But in another very real and very important sense, it's actually true. They weren't anti-anything, they were pro-something. They were rather a mass embracing of and support for those things that are most at risk in the reality we now face. Things such as reproductive rights, the environment, racial justice, peace, the First Amendment, the right to know the needs of the poor and the struggling and the workers, our futures and those of our children. This day was such a success that even the sneerer-in-chief could not find a way to mock it. Now, there were, of course, as there always will be, those who dismiss the 21st as just one big feel-good-about-yourself party. But even those people must have been, or they certainly should have been, astonished by the spontaneous outbreak of protest at airports around the country in the wake of the Rump's un-American order, which, no matter how they try to weasel and parse it, was clearly intended to single out Muslims from the Mideast as inherently suspicious and likely to be terrorists. The result was dramatic as a wave of demonstrations, a wave so dramatic that even major media outlets were using terms like explosion and eruption to describe it. Now, certainly in the minds of many people was Pastor Martin Niemöller's famous poem. There's a lot of versions of this, but this is probably the best known. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. So people stood in dozens of airports and turned out in the streets in numbers ranging from a dozen to over 10,000 in places from Boston to New York to Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to Los Angeles to places you might not expect like Boise, Idaho and Fort Worth, Texas. They did it to welcome immigrants and to say, not this time. History will not repeat itself. Someone will speak out for you. Those actions actually were ethically linked to an earlier act of defiance. This one not in the streets, but in the offices of mayors of U.S. cities, big and small, who reacted with outrage on January 25th after the Rump signed an executive order to cut off federal funding for municipalities that are sanctuary cities, as they are called. These are ones that, to some degree, do not fully and obediently cooperate with the demands of the deporters. The defiant officials in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and smaller cities like New Haven, Syracuse, and Austin, they said they were ready for a fight. In Chicago, Mayor Rahm Emanuel said, "I want to be clear, we're going to stay a sanctuary city. There is no stranger amongst us." Mayor Sam Liccardo of San Jose, Ed Lee of San Francisco, and Libby Schaaf of Oakland together declared that, quoting them, "We will not give in to threats or political grandstanding. The Bay Area will stay true to our values of inclusiveness, compassion, and equality." And perhaps most dramatically, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh said, "To anyone who feels threatened today, you are safe in Boston. If necessary, we will use City Hall itself to shelter and protect anyone who's targeted unjustly. Because not this time." Other signs of the resistance kept cropping up. A woman living in Betsy DeVos's hometown of Holland, Michigan, put together a private Facebook page to call for, a little demonstration, a little protest against her nomination. Apparently word got out because when the day came, over 1,500 people showed up. When the Rump went to a Gopper meeting in Philadelphia on January 26th, he was met with 1,000 protesters. When the Rump moved to shut down the Twitter accounts of various federal agencies to hinder the flow of information to the public, individuals at least 8 of those agencies went rogue and set up private accounts to get around the order. When the Rump announced his pick of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, there were immediate protests not only at the Supreme Court building, but at various federal courthouses around the country. And this all does not stop now. There is ongoing organizing to pressure Congress critters at their local offices, like the Tea Party did, but in this case, for our side. The organizers of the Women's March on Washington have a plan for having some sort of, not on the streets, but still some sort of movement building action every 10 days for the first 100 days of the administration. Speaking of 100 days, the People's Climate Movement is planning a March for Jobs, Justice, and the Climate in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, April 20th, which is the 100th day of Trump time. Other groups are considering a Washington, D.C. march on April 15th, related obviously to taxes, including the Rumps. And there's even talk of a scientist march on Washington to protest the rejection of science by the White House gangsters. I will end with this. Several years ago, William Rivers Pitt wrote that, and I'm quoting here, "We are down to the ethic of total opposition, and as lonely as that estate may be, it is what we have, and we owe it to those who have suffered beyond our comprehension to continue as we began." And yes, today we are down to the ethic of total opposition, and yes, we owe it to those who have and will suffer to continue on. But know this, the resistance continues. It is alive, it is well, and it is even growing. There may well be dark days ahead, but we as a people have not given up, and we will not give up. So celebrate the undeniable fact that you are not alone, and carry it on. And we're going to take a break. And we're back. For the rest of the show, it's something I've talked about. I think I've talked about this on the show before, but I'm going to cover it again here because I think it's something we can use to arm ourselves for the coming arguments with friends and coworkers, and also to inoculate ourselves against the flood of nonsense in which some will try to drown us. It's my list of rules for right-wingers. Now, you have to understand at the start that there are two kinds of people occupying the right-hand side of the American political spectrum. One is conservatives, here understood as people who have an ideology in which they believe, but with whom it is possible to have intelligent disagreement. Those kind of people, unfortunately, are becoming harder and harder to find. because the rest of the right wing, which is now most of the right wing, are the right wing flakes, the nutcases, the wing nuts, the ones I call the wingers. They're almost now the totality of the American right wing, and they make up almost the totality of the National Republican Party and some Democrats, and they are the subject here. Because for some time I had observed with varying degrees of annoyance and bemusement the very predictable tactics that right-wingers use in debates, or rather tactics they use to avoid actual debates. And I actually put together a list of such tactics. Initially there actually were several versions of it because it was really kind of lighthearted. It was really just kind of snarky. But I came to a point when I realized that I had had it. I even remember exactly what prompted that, which I won't go into here for the sake of time. But I realized that I had had it with the evasions, the dodges, the schemes, and slime that make up winger discussions. The list of the rules went from being a snarky list to being a recital of wingnut tactics used on a regular basis to avoid actual factual engagement on issues and to substitute accusation and obfuscation for investigation. And then the list became what it is now, an indictment of the deceit and philosophical bankruptcy that defines the American right. So here it is, the always subject to expansion or refinement list of wingnut arguing tactics and operating procedures. This is as it stands now. The first dozen or so of these are essentially the original list from 7 years ago when it went from snarky to serious. The rest are in the order in which they happen to get added to the list. All right, rule number 1, attack, attack, attack. But don't forget to be deeply offended if anyone on the left responds in kind. Rule number 2, deny, deny, deny. Doesn't matter if it's undeniable, deny it anyway. Rule number 3, when facts are beyond even your ability to deny, change the subject. This can be done in various ways. For example, you could introduce irrelevant details on a tangential point. You could pluck out some phrase in what your opponent said, even if it's something that was just tossed off offhandedly, and focus on that and pretend that that is the actual focus of the entire discussion. You could try to tie your opponent up in such levels of minutia that everybody, including your opponent, loses track of the thread of their argument. Or you could apply rule number 4, which I'll get to in a moment. But whenever possible, always insist that your changed subject is the real subject under discussion. All right, rule number 4. Issue a lengthy, ranting denunciation of the left of the form, what about fill in the blank, being sure to include the words hypocrites and or hypocrisy, thereby arguing that the left can't legitimately criticize the right, while saying that the right can criticize the left. And note, wherever possible, be sure to include the phrase, you liberals, or better yet, you libtards. Rule number 5, make the particular stand for the whole. Find something offensive or silly some liberal or leftist somewhere, sometime said or did, and declare that it identifies the entire left half of the American political spectrum, and demand that your opponents spend their time denouncing that example rather than talking about the actual topic. And because this is, in a sense, a political version of racism, making the particular stand for the whole, this is the rule that right-wingers find it natural and easy to follow. Rule number 6, never answer a question. When faced with one, ignore it and respond with a question, preferably on a different point. If possible, the question should be accusatory, as per rule number 4. If you do not get an answer, repeat the question loudly and demand that you be answered, even as you continue to ignore the question that you were asked in the first place. If you do get an answer, ignore it. If necessary, drop the matter entirely without ever having acknowledged that you got an answer, and if possible, repeat the question, insisting it has not been answered, even if it has. Rule number 7, demand every remotely questionable assertion by your opponent to be proved in every conceivable detail, right down to dates, times, places, and signed affidavits. Refer to all factual assertions by your opponent as just your opinion, even if your demanded level of proof has been supplied. Rule number 8, assert unsourced statistics and facts, or nowadays alternative facts, with great assurance. replied to requests for proof with some variation of, "You can look it up," by which you actually are demanding that your opponents go to the effort to prove your argument for you. Rule number 9, frame the debate in false choices. For example, by responding to objections to expanded NSA spying by saying, "Do you want the U.S. to be attacked or not?" Rule number 10, accuse the accuser. If something you said is challenged as bigoted or otherwise wrongful, say, "You're being intolerant," or better yet, "You're the real racist." Be sure to decry in the course of this the suppression of your free speech. A variation could be called the "I'm rubber and you're glue" method. Insist, even in the absence of any foundation, that any criticism of your methods or tactics actually applies to your opponent. If someone notes that you're avoiding a debate, say, "You're the one who won't debate." Faced with examples of right-wingers lying, say, "That fits you lefties to a T." Rule number 11, when a claim of yours has been debunked, continue to use it nonetheless. When it has been debunked so thoroughly and completely that continuing to use it is counterproductive, drop it. Stop claiming it for a while, maybe a few months, and then bring it up again as if the debunking had never occurred. The attempts to dismiss climate change have produced a good number of examples of this, as repeatedly debunked arguments reappear at almost regular intervals. Rule number 12, when faced with the evil resulting from some other winger following on or acting on your arguments, accuse those who point out that fact of politicizing a tragedy. Never, never, never admit any responsibility for the meaning or impact of your own words. You want examples of that? Just check out after any mass shooting when somebody tries to raise the issue of there being just too damn many guns. If you want a really clear example, look up Dr. George Tiller. Rule number 13, when all else has failed, and even when it hasn't, lie. Recent days have seen a multitude of examples, some of them really quite funny, from the size of inaugural crowds to Tuesday's claim by mouthpiece Sean Spicer that the Rump's immoral and unconstitutional travel ban isn't a travel ban, even though both he and the Rump have called it a ban. Rule number 14, specifically for use on TV discussions, when you fear a contrary point may be raised, shout. If that point is a good point, shout very loudly. Your point may not get heard, but what's important is neither will your opponents. Rule number 15, seize control of the clock of history. Choose the period of time most advantageous to your arguments and insist that any events that occurred outside that time frame, either before it or after it, are irrelevant and must be ignored. Rule number 16, you could call this the both sides now tactic. When something some right-winger has done or said is so bad that it just you can't explain it away, just airily dismiss it with both sides do it. Feel free to employ false equivalencies, such as, to give an actual example, equating people who wore anti-war t-shirts to a George Bush rally with people carrying loaded assault rifles to Obama appearances. Rule number 17, all debate stops when you win, and only when you win. The first part of that is easily seen in the frequent crack along the lines of, "You lost, get over it," and this doesn't only come from right-wing wingnut trolls on comment threads. On Tuesday, Senate Majority Leader Fishface McConnell said it's time for Democrats to get over the fact they lost the election. But the second part of that rule is important and is often overlooked. To the wingers, any issue, even any election, is questionable as long as they haven't won. And before you question the inclusion of election in that, recall the last 8 years of Kenyan-born Muslim and the Rump's campaign strategy last fall of insisting the 2016 election was rigged so that if Clinton won, then he could claim that she was an illegitimate president. But if you want a real example, gun control. In 2008, in the infamous Heller decision, the Supreme Court, for the first time in U.S. history, ruled that gun ownership was an individual right. Ever since then, the gun nuts, who overlap heavily with the wing nuts, have been snickering, "The Supreme Court has spoken, the debate is over." The thing is, in ruling as it did, the Supreme Court rejected the central logic of U.S. v. Miller, a 1939 Supreme Court case which until 2008 had been the controlling precedent. Miller held that for a weapon to have constitutional protection, it must have some, and this is a quote, reasonable relation to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. And the right of possession, he said, was a collective one, not an individual one. Now, I'm not going to argue about gun control here. That's not the point. The point is, in the 69 years that Miller was the law, did you ever, at any time in that entire period, hear any gun nut, any NRA type, ever say, even once, the Supreme Court has spoken, the debate is over? Of course you didn't. Because the right wing only knows two responses to issues and events. It's up for debate, and we won, the debate's over, shut up. But the winger patience for debate is extremely limited, which brings up rule number 18. Rule 18 is, if you can't win by the rules, change them. A great example of this is voter suppression. The right wing knows it can't win if the mass of the American public votes, so it's been engaged in a years-long battle, years-long effort to make it harder and harder for the people they think will not vote reactionary to vote at all. Rule number 19, which in a way sums up the whole thing, intellectual consistency and honesty are for wusses and losers. For recent examples, we could consider Fish-Face McConnell whining and sniveling about how those mean old Democrats are going to oppose Neil Gorsuch after having just some months ago said he would refuse even to hold a hearing on Merrick Garland if Clinton won the election. We also have John McCain immediately endorsing Gorsuch and looking forward to a vote, despite having said in October that the Goppers in the Senate would be, quote, united against any Supreme Court nominee that Hillary Clinton would put up. But you want an almost too good to be true example? Late in the evening of Election Day 2012, it looked for a time that Obama might lose the popular vote to witless Romney, despite having won the electoral vote handily. In response, the rump went on a tweet rampage, calling the election a total sham and a travesty, and the Electoral College a disaster for democracy, because he, that is Obama, lost the popular vote and won the election. We should have a revolution in this country. Now fast forward to 2016, and you know the rest. All right, finally for now, Rule 20, Sitzfleisch. It's German for sitting flesh. And it goes back to the days before chess clocks put time constraints on games. And players would sometimes win games by simply taking so long to move that their opponent would either simply give up or become so tired with the wait that they'd make foolish mistakes. So more generally, it can be taken to mean winning by virtue of sheer unmitigated stubbornness. The right wing is a past master at employing Sitzfleisch, and frankly, this is one rule we should adopt because we need to be as persistent as they are stubborn. Okay, that's it for now. You might amuse yourself over the next weeks and months by listing how many of the rules get invoked by right-wingers every time they open their mouth. Something which I've mentioned before in bringing up these rules, by the way, is that I'm sure that a lot of us have been guilty of at least one of these sins, and in the course of an argument, especially if it got heated. But occasional examples in the heat of the moment are not the point here. What's the point here is this is a consistent pattern of the right of evasion and deceit. It is about being an intellectual coward. It is about being a bully. It is about being a liar. It is about being an American right-winger. Right, that's it for this week. We will see you back next week with more doom and gloom and hope and happiness. In the meantime, you, as always, have the best week you possibly can. Peace.